Europe? No, it doesn't. That's the interesting point. They want to continue the fighting. They want Ukraine to continue fighting, but it's not for the benefit of Europe. As a matter of fact, they want to continue with sanctions. There will be hardly any, I don't see a resumption of the dialogue between Russia and Europe, even if Ukrainians achieve some result in Istanbul, to be honest, at least not in the short term. Probably in the long term that will happen. And I think Vladimir Putin acknowledged recently that in the long run, there will be a resumption of dialogue and all that will be, at one point, will be forgotten. But in the short, probably midterm, we'll probably continue to have this split as long as we have people like Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas and all that. And as long as we have this kind of spirit in the European Union, which is, as I already mentioned in your show, that we have this European policy which is strongly influenced by the Baltic states and Poland and all that. As long as we have that, there is no much hope to have a honest resumption of dialogue with Russia, because these countries are so adverse to, as it comes to Keir Starmer, UK and France. The problem is that now they have this kind of aggressive stance as an alternative for having no policy towards Russia. That's the problem. They don't have any policy. And we see that on the diplomatic stage, they are absolutely absent. They are irrelevant, completely irrelevant. On the Macron side, we can imagine, because he is extremely narcissist. It's a very Adonis type of character, and I feel that this is the kind of person who wants to have a very visible role in things. He doesn't care if it has no impact, he just wants to be seen. And that's probably what motivates the role of France. The thing is that if the US is supporting the process that has been proposed by Vladimir Putin, if the Ukrainians are ready to play ball with the US and indirectly with the Russians to have these talks in Istanbul, probably Macron may change his mind in order to be on the right side of history, if you want. Because these guys, they don't have strategy. Their strategy is merely based on communication, on PR, period. There is no real sense of what they want to achieve. They don't even know what, I'm not sure they understand exactly what the Russians want. So, and that's a source of concern, as I'm former intelligence, strategic intelligence. So for me, it's essential that when you start to make decisions at government level, that you understand your enemy or your adversary, depending on your first point. And the second point, that you understand where you want to go. Where are you heading to? That's the key aspect. Then you may have different approaches or different strategies to address these objectives, but the objectives must be adjusted to your adversary. You cannot have an adversary and have an objective which is not. You had the second round that happened in Istanbul. And end of March, as negotiations were going on the right track, France and Germany asked Russia to withdraw their troops from Kiev, the Kiev area, as a sign of goodwill. And since everything was going smoothly in Istanbul, the Russians accepted. They said, okay, fair enough. The negotiations are going well, and they had retired their troops from Kiev. And as soon as they had done that, the Europeans came back, and not just Boris Johnson was obviously the one that came in more prominently, but the European Union came and said, we stop the process. At that point, the Ukrainian delegation had already signed the agreement, but they asked Zelensky to withdraw Ukraine from the talks, and therefore Ukraine stopped. So what they wanted to achieve was simply the withdrawal of all the Russian forces from the Kiev area. That's all. So these experiences show that the Western party, like obviously Ukraine and the Europeans, use the negotiation process therefore the strategy must then, it may change, of course, you may have different approach to the problem, but it has to be directed towards this objective. And that's exactly the problem with people like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. They are not the brightest people in the shop. They are not. They look so, they pretend so, but they are not. And the quality of head of state is its ability to develop strategies and to act according to set strategies and clear objectives. They don't have any. In fact, the Minsk agreement was asking for negotiation between Kiev and the two republics. So the Ukrainians signed, but they never started the negotiations. And that's why the whole process took so long and eventually was in fact abandoned by the Ukrainians as soon as they got the military capabilities and capacities to attack the Donbass. And that's exactly what happened in February 2022. Putin said that happened once, that will not happen twice. In fact, it almost happened in April 2022 because, as you remember, we had this second negotiation round. In fact, there was a first one the day after the start of the military operation, and this first round of negotiation happened at the Belarus border at the initiative of Zelensky, by the way. He asked for a negotiation. European Union came and said stop, so they stopped. And if things are going well, we may suspend military activities. But for now, we are fighting. You tricked us before, and now we continue on that path. We have the negotiation parallel to the military operations. And that's the way. So that's also an incentive for Ukraine not to play with time as they did with the Minsk agreement, where the Minsk agreement, I remind you, was signed in February 2015, and it never moved ahead. So the idea by proceeding with military operation is to force the Ukrainians to have a real discussions and to achieve a result, not just talking, but having a result. So I think it was a wise answer No, I think Russia has exactly the same strategy it always had. They said, we don't want ceasefires, especially ceasefires that are hanging in the air. They wanted to have, and that's what Vladimir Putin said on the 14th of June last year to the officials of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He said, if the Ukrainians decide or accept to talk to us and have open negotiations, we'll ceasefire. That's not a problem. So this is not a matter of stopping fire. But what Putin said at that time is that there will be no ceasefire without negotiation. So they don't want to be in a situation that you had, for instance, in the Minsk agreement that the Ukrainians signed. So this is the consequence of this conflict in Ukraine will be extremely long-lasting in the sense that it has destroyed the confidence that the rest of the world has towards the West, with the US and with the Europeans. With the Europeans, certainly. The Europeans are probably the biggest losers. So now we are in a situation where everybody knows what each party wants, and therefore that's probably the reason why Putin made this proposal. And that, I think, was a very wise answer to the ultimatum that the Europeans made. It's very interesting that in the media, especially in Europe, there were some expressions they used that the ultimatum proposed by the Europeans. You don't propose an ultimatum. An ultimatum is precisely exactly what it means in Latin. This is the last point. Ultima means the last. So there is no discussion after that. So when you say ultimatum, that's the last thing we'll say, and then we start. And for the Europeans, it was to launch massive sanctions and all that. So it was not a proposal, or it's a proposal like in the movie The Godfather, where you have Marlon Brando saying he will make a proposal you can use. So this is a mafia-like. And secondly, he said we can trust that they will fulfill their obligation. And that's exactly what the US is noticing regarding Israel. Israel is not respecting what it signed. So you cannot trust Israel. And it's very interesting to see that in the same speech, Trump insisted on the bravery of the Houthis and the fact you can trust them for an agreement. And I interpreted that as a message towards Israel. If you look at all the context, that the Americans, yes, they will support Israel for many reasons, domestic reasons, and probably historic reasons and all that. But at the same time, they realize that you cannot really trust them. Israel will work only for its own interest, will not even look at the regional interest. And if Israel has the ability to destroy everything around him, it will do that. And that's not the philosophy of the US. Wants to be influential in the region, definitely. They definitely want to have this leading role, which they have, by the way, because when it comes to the solution in the Middle East, nobody talks about the Europe again. But when we talk about agreements and things like that, everybody looks at the US. Nobody looks at the European Union, or even at any European country. Meaning that they have this role, they want to keep this role to be influential in the region. But at the same time, they realize that so far, especially during the Cold War, they relied on Israel because Israel was some kind of advanced Western position in a Middle East that was strongly related to the Soviet Union, with differences depending on countries, probably not Jordan, for instance. But when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Egypt in certain phases and all that, obviously they were either related or, yes, they had relation or strong relation with Soviet Union, or they were non-aligned, which for the US is not a good thing. And therefore now they are trying to reestablish relations with all these countries and to keep this kind of influence. We see that with Saudi Arabia. And probably this is this idea of Trump by having a deal with Iran. They see that Iran now has normal relation with other Arab countries. I mean, with Arab countries, because Iran is not an Arab country. But now we have that, and probably the US understand that if they want to keep their role in the region, they cannot just rely on Israel. Meaning that US will have to face will face, in fact, three powers. The rest of the world as a whole, China in terms of trade, and Russia in the sense of a military strategic or geostrategic power. So we'll have that, and that will probably increase with the time, meaning that the Russians understand that perfectly well, and they understand that anything that may happen with Trump today might become a past. Therefore, the strategy must then, it may change, of course, and you may have different approach to the problem, but it has to be directed towards this objective. And that's exactly the problem with people like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. They are not the brightest people in the shop. They are not. They look so, they pretend so, but they are not. And the quality of head of state is his ability to develop strategies and to act according to set strategies and clear objectives. They don't have any. Neither UK nor France have clear objectives in that. So it's just a matter of getting a high profile, and probably because as of now the US got this profile, France may be willing to compete to some extent. Therefore, the competition that exists between the US and the rest of the world will continue to increase. So that's certain. It will probably take some time because obviously the US now is not in a position to fight, quotation marks, to fight. So this is really a change, and I've been literally a Cold Warrior because I was in the intelligence world during the Cold War. So we experienced the war in one-to-one scale, but we never had such a spirit of destructive type of spirit that we have today, that we see today in Europe. So I think we went backwards in Europe, definitely. We are not improving. We regressed. It's a regression, an intellectual, even philosophical, and even I would say, in terms of human relation, it is a regression that we have. Remember that, for instance, in France, if you have a name that sounds like Russian, you don't need to be Russian. Even if your name sounds Russian, a bank can refuse you to open a bank account. So we are beyond rational. We are beyond reason. It has become totally insane. And this has never been so in the Cold War. So I think we are definitely witnessing a regression of humanity in Europe. The Americans try to prepare the context, if you want. That means first to have channel of communications with Russia, meaning reestablishment of the normal diplomatic relations, including running the embassies in both countries and things like that. So that was the biggest part of the actual negotiations between US and Russia. Now, and then all the discussions between Witkoff and Putin was about understanding the position of Russia, because obviously they noticed that there was a huge discrepancy between what Keith Kellogg was proposing for the discussion and what the Russians wanted. So the whole thing for the Americans was to identify up to which point the Russians were ready to discuss what was absolutely no-goes and what could be negotiated. So that's a little bit the idea, but they never negotiated. As a matter of fact, we are in something which is, it's primary school type of politics and foreign policy, which is the level of what we had as kids, period. And that's not something that can help to restore the trust and the credibility of the West. And that's what we have seen before. We have mentioned that before today. That's exactly what the West is now missing when it comes to the rest of the world. They don't trust the West anymore. They see how they behave up to the point to destroy themselves. It's almost a suicidal type of foreign policy when it comes to the sanctions against Russia and all that. This is beyond common sense. And remember that what we are witnessing today has never been so, even during the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, the Russians / Soviets at the time have delivered natural gas to Europe since the late 60s without interruption. Even after Prague, even after Afghanistan, even the Russians never stopped to deliver gas. Even when they had sanctions, even when they never stopped to have that. And we tried to avoid to apply sanctions on the Soviet Union. There was some restriction, embargo on certain technologies and all that, but that was all the technologies that were related to national security and all that. So that was a kind of standard procedure in the Cold War. But there have never been the animosity that we are and that we see today have never been so during the Cold War. We talked to the Soviets at the time, even if we didn't agree with them. We are fighting a system, the communist system. We didn't want to be communist. Obviously not, for good or bad reason, but that was a stance. But that didn't prevent us to talk to them. And we had dialogue with the Russians, with the Soviets. with all the Warsaw Pact countries. We never had this kind of obsessive approach